I have perhaps been remiss in getting back to talking about my psychological research. It's been sadly a necessary abatement. I do have recordings which I'm loath to upload because they contain so much raw emotional discharge, and I think what happened was essentially uh, I cracked some in Scientology speak basic engrams. Essentially, my whole bank came up to real time, and most of it was being blown, although there was still some thematic, um, conceptual confusions, because a lot of my bank is essentially is counter effort material. It's because this is complicated, but essentially my psychological research, I now can finally define what my psychological research is, which is essentially um, the false ego in a metaphysical constructed deep theory of mind. So it's a metaphysical philosophical somewhat, okay, this is a bit too complicated to summarize, but um, so there's that, and then there are essentially field circuits in which people can exchange their, let's say, internal karmic mechanism of the false ego complex. They can use that to energize what become external field circuits of karmic exchange, in which you are essentially lining up people's false egos a bit like serial computers or pools of collective masses, as it were, and there are four distinct realms as well. So essentially, largely speaking, there isn't just one pool of karma that the world is entrenched in. There are four separate domains of field circuits, and they can perhaps grossly interact with one another, but they can't subtly interact with one another. But in terms of an individual's false ego complex, depending on their profile, they can translate their, they can exchange and transpose the subtle energy of one of those field circuits into subtle energy of another field circuit. So through that person, they can essentially become an exchange, and essentially in their false ego, they can be a nexus of comporting the four field circuits, roughly speaking, into some kind of alignment, as it were. Um, that's a very fancy way of saying also that there are, and I could derive this answer, but I haven't derived this answer yet. But there are only very certain false ego complexes that have presentations. Uh, what I mean by that, that have circuitry, false ego circuitry, which plugs them in to more than one or two or three of the fields. So some types are more generalist, universalist than others in some sense, and I haven't actually run the numbers, but essentially, and this means that in some sense one has more than one effigy of one's spiritual influence. There, one has more than one character, and this is also why people transpose onto one another and they project onto one another, and why people see resemblances between one another, especially when they are in their own cycle of melodrama and their recursive kind of drama, which they are in some process. I mean, a lot of people, they don't even catch that drama. They don't even realize that they are perpetrating on in a subtle way the same cycle metadrama, as it were. And in some sense, you can only really understand that from my metatype type of modeling of the metaphysical somewhat thing. And then also, so in one of my recordings, which I don't know, this is at some point I'll have to try to work out how I can upload the stuff, because there is important things in those recordings which I will have to. I don't want to go back and field it out myself and then repeat it into the recording, um, because that's just too much work for me at the moment. Because that's like 4 hours. They're probably about 4 hours of recordings, at least, maybe 5, that I have now not uploaded. But so let me just outline then what's missing. So what I'm trying to say is that in those 4 hours, which a lot of that is personal therapy on my account, as it were, and actually even a bit of a regression where I essentially looked, I think, at my whole false ego complex from the point of view of the superego, which is how essentially my whole bank came up to present time and essentially was trying to blow in present time. And then I was seeing thematic resemblances. I mean, I felt like I was blowing charge on the World Bank, as it were. But I mean, that could have just been a transpersonal projection. What should I say? But anyway, I made important distinctions in those past recordings where I spoke about how metatype is the form in which the false ego operates. So it's like the form of the content, but it doesn't describe the content, but it describes the form of the content. And metagram is a representation of the style of the content, but also not the content. So both of my two models do not actually tell you what the actual content is. But if you have the style and you have the form, then between the two, one can navigate pretty clearly as to what's happening and perhaps also what needs to happen in terms of some kind of treatment or prognosis or therapy or something like that. But anyway, the interesting thing though is that, and I still, well, this is a bit of a question mark, but this I explore this in the 4 hours perhaps that I'm not going to upload, is that the superego essentially is only metatype and not metagram. There is no metagram content in the superego, except for to say that the superego is something like the basic engram or something like that, to use Scientology jargon. Now, moving forward, now the actual structure of metatype is really what allows my theory of mind to outcompete, I would say, the whole of psychology, because I've actually got an ontological explanation as to also to understand certain what I would consider to be developmental personality disorders, essentially, like ADHD and things like that. I think I've roughly got the mechanical switches and such all there, to explain what's going on there. Still have a big question mark in my head, because when I developed my system, let's say purely theoretically, there could have been 72 metagram types, but I did not even bother to map out the last 24. I only mapped 48 because I literally believed that the 24 that I was going to devise were just utterly not feasible. They weren't possible. That although in the framework of my system, because essentially these are just possibilities, like metagram was computationally, um, uh, uh, it, 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 it was computationally permutated from essentially elemental, in the alchemical sense, in some sense, in the elemental, within some certain framework of metatype, that essentially that, in the tentative, I mean, look, I mean, it was the hardest jump to get from, because metatype I created in some sense probably was well enough understood by me when I was 8 years old. I'd already worked out metatype, but it took me literally 22 years of just studying people in the most basic sort of way, empathizing, emulating their emotions. I mean, it was simply emotional resonance in some sense, before I could even. I mean, it took me a major manic episode in my early 20s, essentially, to compile and compress that dense amount of very particular kind, because you had to have metatype essentially in the back of your mind while you are understanding different people very, very closely. And anyway, I mean, this, I can't do justice in a summary, but and I'm going to lose the thread of this if I go into that. But so let me just leave that as a heading there, because that itself is but in some sense, the only model from Metatype that I actually used to develop Metagram was the six model. Was that essentially you have a death, a lust, a vanity, an enticed lust, a trial, and a sin. Um, it now turns out quite clearly that in some sense, the superego is only an enticed lust, and therefore it can be considered to be kind of in MBTI jargon, the enticed lust corresponds to the parent function. Um, if I want to correspond my system to another system, the closest that comes to resemblance of it is the four sides of the mind model of MBTI. And in some sense, I have essentially a radically revised version of the four sides of the mind in which it would not be recognizable as Myers-Briggs at all, which is MBTI is Myers-Briggs. That's what that means. And because essentially in Myers-Briggs, there are only 16 MBTI types, and they are all formulaically derived. And when you expand them to four sides of the mind, if you just know two, if you know any two functions in the four sides of the mind, you know all the other functions. You can work it out. You just need to know two things. In my system, you only need to know one thing, and you know everything. If you just know one function in one slot, you know the meta type that you're talking about. So that's the difference, is that my thing is somewhat more bespoke, or somewhat more, because the actual foundation of it is already settled, because it is already a metaphysic, it is already a deep theory of, or a metaphysical account of consciousness. So at least in the sense of the experiential phenomenological aspect of consciousness. So it is a, it's like a 17-step pyramid, or as the Shinto would say, 9 spheres of heaven and 8 spheres of earth, which they, I would say, represented as the 13 circles on their ceremonial dresses, which now the Shinto Buddhists still wear on their ceremonial dresses, and they don't even know how that might correspond to 8 spheres of earth and 9 spheres of heaven. But anyway, the symbolism aside, I don't take that as an authority. Um, it's very complicated, the 17 model. In this, but anyway, I mean, it's like Kabbalah basically, but it's also it's very much actually like Kabbalah, but instead of all these Jewish people, they are so offended when you mispronounce their words. But I'll just say it in my basic tongue, as it were. But the Sephiroth, uh, Sepirot. I don't know how you say it, but the Sephira, I believe, is the plural, perhaps. But the so in some sense, I mean, I don't even know how I would depict it as, because you wouldn't even have. I mean, the closest thing I depict it as is the 13 essentially, but you have to see it as a table. I would say it doesn't work as a symbolic sort of thing. I don't think you can. Anyway, I mean, not important. but yeah, it's not worth it to correspond that much to all these ancient sort of things. And I've done that before. Because there is a 12 extraction from the 17. You can extract because there's a final 5 and then there's an extracted 12, and the extracted 12 are the elemental components of what the Hindu call sattva, rajas, and sattva, rajas, and tamas, the three gunas, the three natures of the material world. Um, but I must say, I have problems with the Hindu philosophy greatly because, it's either, it's not bad, but it's not updated, as it were. Like they complain about the material nature too much, and they don't understand that the material nature is exactly what you need to be self-realized. It's the right kind of thing that you need to work out how to transcend, to reach the spiritual world, as it were, because it's not about the material nature in at least the subtle components of material nature. Um, there's something that binds all three of them, which is in some sense the problem of time, or the concept of time, or the uh, so the temporality of material nature is in some sense the height of the spiritual. But anyway, um, is that can you overcome the temporality and this is what's in the Christian scriptures, by the way. But anyway, let me not delve into uh, disparate doctrines and such. But it's quite interesting that you get the sword and the stone from the 13 circles, because you have to place a cross over it in order to get the 17 from the 13. Um, anyway, not that important. And for me, that's where the Trinity are. The Trinity are within the 17. They make up three of the final 5. The other 2 are the blood, and I don't even know what to call the other one, to tell you the truth. Um, I've poetically called it. I can't find a direct mention of it in the scriptures. Maybe I would be able to find it in some, but it's sort of, I call it I think I've called it the fire of the Lord, the fire of the altar, perhaps the fire of the fire in the eyes. Um, I think I might have called it the Spirit of the Lord once. Um, the Lord God of hosts. I think for some reason that name, the Lord God of hosts, as distinct from, but it's anyway. Let me move on. Not get bogged down by strange uh, mystical ramblings. But this is not really that important to link these things to. At some point, I think that's So I can take this psychology and have it distinct from, at certain levels it's distinct from spirituality. But at some point, when you actually realize what's going on here, and you realize what is good for mental health and what is bad for mental health, using my models, or at least in terms of self-actualization, which is essentially, or positive psychology. If you were to take the positive psychology of my research, then I think you get at least my reduction, um, of what is actually being said in the Christian scripture, which is very different from most people's beliefs. It's Christ consciousness. It's that Christ is an understanding, spiritual understanding. And in that way, I think it's also quite compatible with lots of more secular sort of things, but it's also quite particular and peculiar. And in some sense, I do often rely on the Christian metaphor, because you need a low resolution map in order to know that now we're talking about the crucifixion, and now we're talking about the Trinity, because you have, and I do in some sense believe that that's the only way that you can actually situate yourself in understanding the 17 model, is with those kinds of images and those kinds of, because you'll never understand it if you just have to have it click at once at the end of a 100-hour dissemination. You have to say that, okay, well, now we've gone into this subject because we all know that there's a crucifixion somewhere in the story, and we all know that there's a Trinity somewhere in the story, and we all know that there's a church somewhere in the story. What do all these things mean? And you can't have a battle on two fronts. So at some point we have to say, okay, well, now we've made progress on this topic. Now we're going to focus on another topic, and then we're going to return to it, and now see that there was also a secret mystery, and that's how it unfolds essentially. But anyway, I hate saying these things because I say them so often in my recordings. And I feel that this is, then it takes up all the time. Okay, so what haven't I included now? So I have basically, probably in the Scientology sense, I have now, I think, in my own understanding, although not in my own notes, I have grounded field circuits, which is a huge advancement, because this will allow for a certain level of field auditing that was before not possible. I have then also been deluded with the great sense of now the problem that we have in society and culture to a large extent. I mean, I've always been a big sort of structural person, as it were, being able, I think, to have a very deep and penetrating view of what is more on the symptom side of things, and what is more on the structural defect. Anyway, and I have just noticed, that there are problems in, let's say, people being primed by their municipal cultures and enculturated into a certain decadent proclivity to exacerbate and then feed off of their own malcontentedness, and it's interesting. I mean, you can see this. I mean, it's funny because I would even like to think that I was a certain kind of emo child growing up, perhaps even one of the early prototypes, perhaps. Um, I think I exhibited it perhaps before it even was coined, the term emo. But I do think that I was a certain kind of emo, though, and I do think that there are spectrums in all things, as it were. But I think that there is some importance to being emo, because one is witnessing one's own emotional state, and witnessing, one is perhaps being a sensitive antenna to the field circuits about one, and perhaps it's because one has a distinct reading of at least two field circuits, that one is engaged in at least two field circuits. Now, I just want to say that, and I can't be sure about this, but without, you see, sadly, this I would be, if I was more studious. I need to get my research matters into a more readable form for myself. I need to learn how to code so I can have it displayed back to myself with a certain level of specificity, and so that I can compare and contrast my own insights, as it were. But I can sort of anticipate that it seems to me that there are some types that are fundamentally locked into a kind of internal karmic automation that, although that they might have links to two field circuits because of their particular guna, they can only internally propitiate or clean up what becomes essentially an internal filter, and which can become essentially a recursive internal filter. And so you can sort of, and I mean, I've described this in some of my other recordings in terms of the kind of the toxic interplay between the parent function of one side of the mind and and uh, the inferior function of another side of the mind, and how essentially the inferior function of that then deeper side of the mind is in some sense aggregating to itself a particular kind of self-afflicted simplicity. It is in some sense confabulating a certain kind of false dilemma in order that it might predispose the parent function of the proceeding side of the mind to be somewhat, relatively speaking, apathetic to the receiving aspects of that other side of the mind. And this this is actually specifically described by um, Metagram, and specifically Rajasic, what I have now relabeled Rajasic, because I always used to consider myself, in my, perhaps in my faux humility or whatever, but I didn't have the definitional resources to make any other claim, but I just always thought of myself as being Rajasic. And so I actually, and I've now changed that view, and I keep on having to repeat this because otherwise, some of my I mean, if anything happens to me or something like that, I want my work to at least be capable of continuing in some form. Um, but yeah, in any of my notes predating, I think, this year, 2020, um, unless, I mean, I've made posters now where I have literally crossed out Rajas and typed Sattva next to it, just to show that I've changed this label. But essentially, the emotional tones that correspond to condescending, condescending, anxious, bashful, eager. Um, Man, I can't even think of all the emotional tones for Rajas. So these used to, so condescending, bashful, eager, and they're five more because they're eight. There are eight emotional tones in each one, and these emotional tones, I mean, these are just labels as well because they all have functional definitions. They are all defined by um, the 12 the 12 that are taken out of the 17 model, that essentially are the conduits of karma, whereas the final five are something like the awareness of the awareness. They are so integrated into one's internal sense of self that they cannot actually form part of karma. And in some sense, anyway, I don't want to get into that esoteric topic, but the thing is that and when I say karma, I guess in a Christian sense, you can just read sin, because you see, sin is not a personal problem. Sin is an emergent thing, and in fact, it's very healthy to be conscious of one's own sin. In fact, it's required to be conscious of one's own sin in order to go through the crucifixion, which is a mental technology, as it were. It is Uh, uh, that's something I have to re-examine. But if I could just refine the 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 mechanism, because essentially then by the metatype I would be able to, but be able to perhaps describe for some types how they could channel the crucifixion. Um, it, but yeah, this is problematic because all of this is so experimental, and I've only worked on myself essentially. But what am I saying? But I've come into other problems as well, because you see, I'm a metatype 13 only, and they're metatype 14s and 15s and 16s and 17s, and I do actually believe that are fundamentally there are fundamental defects with those metatypes. But I do think it is possible to get those metatypes novated. But anyway, that's a topic that I wanted to bring up in this recording. But let me just get to it naturally. So what was I saying? Is that uh, and the explanation that I have for that is now I've lost my thread on where I was getting there organically. Is that essentially some people have a false ego which is literally functionally dependent on someone projecting sin in a field circuit. That the metatypes 14, 15, 16, and 17 are essentially they're in the it's weird because I haven't exactly made up my mind yet, but I think that they might even correspond to certain spiritual gifts that they would actually function within churches. That they would essentially hold certain offices, but in certain they would need a certain cultural inclination or something, or they would need a certain indoctrination, in fact, in order to not be toxic. But if they are doing their function in the field, the ENTP journalist, as it were, the ENFJ, I can't even think what ENFJs are good for, but essentially that the one is a kind of intellectual sympathy, and the other one is a kind of emotional sympathy, and then if they can convince society at large that their form of what I would actually call a kind of vampirism, karmic vampirism, is essentially should be considered a kind of a righteous form of consolation, that you actually have um, you end up creating sort of towers of Babel. You end up creating lots of iniquity, lots of projection onto other people, um, lots of, let's say, historical repetitiveness, as it were. And in some sense, I believe that these are perhaps the types that have fallen off the edge of the earth. They have gone over the four corners and then reached the other side of the map, as it were. So if you see the map as a rectangle with four corners and four sides, that you when you go over the edge, then you come up the other way. And these people have done that, so they are beyond their own standing. They do not stand as individuals. They stand as purveyors of groups or something. And I think that perhaps Metatype 15s could be evangelists to some degree, but I think I don't know. I really don't know what I'm talking about. This is somewhat speculative. Um, but I do think that those metatypes, there might be some of them that take on some form. I mean, they might be essentially the goats to some degree as well. Uh, they might be goats, and goats are not evil people at all. In some sense, I think that what they actually require is they require a culture where everything is clearly delineated. Because if you have ambiguity in culture, or if you have ambiguity, rather not when I shouldn't just say culture, I should say ambiguity in the hard structures of a society, in the legal structure. If there isn't a book somewhere that answers the question, then the goat is going to eat anything in the midst of the ambiguity that is created by the essentially the confusion, in the shadow that is cast by the unenlightened structure. Then essentially the goats go to war between the shadows, and anything happens. So in some sense, I think, anyway, I also think that perhaps that they also can do the mental crucifixion, I think, and if they did so, it would be fine. But I guess what I'm saying is that, well, yeah. So I don't know, and I shouldn't talk too much. But they would also be able to be congregants at the very least, and perhaps even. But I guess in the fallen state of not performing, let's say, the mental crucifixion, um, because the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is not a vicarious sacrifice. It is the way that you must follow. It is, I die daily, is what is said in Corinthians. But anyway. So anyway, that's very, very problematic for me at the moment. Also, those metatypes might themselves be marks of something else, because I think I have decoded the sin that is not unto death. That the sin that is not unto death, which can be accorded, uh, I think has somewhat even two varieties. But because there's one sin that is not unto death, which I think in some sense cannot even be rectified, because essentially the kind of spiritual life that has been taken in this lifetime uh, was already chosen before. This is, you see, if I say this, it just sounds like crazy magic talk or whatever. But essentially, when you're between the grave, the spirit, the spirit will do whatever it wills to do. The spirit can divide itself into 1,000 copies and send itself into 1,000 different lifetimes and 1,000 different times, and it can compile those in whatever order it so wishes. The spiritual realm does not have temporal fixtures to it. And sometimes some people are having an experience in one lifetime because they weren't trying to have a single life. They were, in fact, trying to have the opposite of a single life, because they wanted, it was just meant to be an ingredient in some recipe or something like that. But there's a perfect conservation of the spirit. It's you know what bears record of it, what bears witness to it, and nothing is, I don't want to talk to I, I don't want to talk to, because if you try to formulate this into a construct, into a belief, it's not really a belief. That it's a very poisonous form of belief, which is why I don't even want to sort of utter these sorts of things, because they just sound like narratives and fairy tales. So I'd rather not even talk about these things. Um, and I also think that there is a physical component to these things, which is why essentially don't think I want to talk about the blood right now, but because I don't think the blood is a material thing. The blood is a spiritual thing, but it is witnessed more than metaphorically in our blood. Let me try to just talk about the blood in a spiritual sense for a while. If you sleep badly, if you eat badly, if you take drugs, if you do something with your body, it stays with you for at least 36 hours or something like that. You're going to have a living record of it that you are going to be able to feel inside of yourself. You're going to feel it as because everything that you do, or the bad hormones that you produce because of the bad mood that you were in, it lingers in your blood until it's cleared by your blood. So you have a channel of manifestation. You have a conduit that gives you your potential energy to engage and negotiate and interact. And the liveliness of the blood, or let's say the willingness of the blood to spill itself, to expend itself, uh, that is a form of self-limitation, let's just say, uh, to some degree, because the one can have responsibility within one's, also, in some sense you could say, well, I can't choose what's put into my blood if a psychiatrist comes and pumps me full of pharmaceuticals. I can't, if the policeman locks me up and throws away the key. What so the blood, the sanctity of the blood, as it were, when it's not protected by law, is, I think, a fundamental. It tells you something about your society. It tells you something about the faith of your society, in that self-determinism is just one signature away from one authority, that the sanctity of your blood is is not a holy accordance, that the citizen is sovereign in their protection thereof. I mean, at least if you want to expend the flesh, if at least if you want to smack someone, at least if you want to punish the flesh, at least the poison that might sympathetically uh, uh, correspond in the reaction that the blood has to the punishment of the body, at least that's in-house. At least the boundary is not broken. You understand? I mean, assault and battery is one way to inflict malady and illness on someone's uh, uh, physiology, and it will obviously reside as some quality in the blood, but at least the blood uh, uh, is not confused, is not itself violated by some external authority which owns it, which has put it into a kind of what I would call, it's one thing to punish someone. It's one thing that the medievals did, to hang people, to draw and quarter them, to do any manner of barbarism and things like that, to do all these things. Obviously, these are not things that I'm recommending, but I'm just saying that there's a certain kind of, what didn't they do when even they did all those horrible, nasty things to people, because they couldn't work out how to, let's say, reconcile and have some kind of process of rehabilitation. Even, so I think the hope of rehabilitation has civilized people to some degree, but then what have we croned towards? What have we leaned into? Is that let's use pharmaceuticals, and do we know what we do? Are we just using people as lab rats? Is this all just a scientific experiment? And now we have actually degenerated in a much, anyway. It's an interesting parallel to make. I mean, I would just say that I have been treated by psychiatry, and although I wouldn't lay the blame specifically at the practitioners that did this to me, but at a legal systems level, at a cultural level, I think I have been failed, because there have been geniuses before me, and you'll excuse myself to declare that I am also a genius, but that Wittgenstein had uh, a psychotic breakdown in his early 20s. Milton had a psychotic breakdown in his early 20s. Newton had a psychotic breakdown in his early 20s. And they all recovered because they weren't pumped full of psychiatric medications. You know, Wittgenstein was so distinct in his later thinking that they literally called him Wittgenstein II in the literature to distinguish his earlier works, which were so differently characterized. You know, there are certain uh, you know, I mean, I would say that it's somewhat. You know, I mean, I don't want to comment too much about the physiological aspect of this, but essentially, some people have a much more, let's say, sophisticated constitution because they are walking a false ego complex, which is immensely more complicated, and it's in fact impossible to calibrate it perfectly. You need a second bite at the cherry, and so what often happens is you get essentially an exhaustion of let's say the tentative operating principle, and essentially it works out that it's not going to be able to execute on the will. It works out that the sin is essentially endemic and inexorable. And so what it does is, because it has already experienced the truth, it literally unwinds itself back to the beginning. And then your whole bank of information is seen again, and then you plug in a new function. You plug in a new operative purpose, or whatever. And I mean, I'd already anticipated this. I mean, this sounds like hubris and bragging and perhaps like mad rantings, but essentially, I mean, in my research, I had already spoken to probably the most senior psychologist who was, uh, let me say it, a secret friend of the family, as it were, but I can't even remember his first name, but his surname, but you know, the it's awkward to talk about family history like this, but the grandfather of my half sister, uh, Kruger, Professor Kruger, who was an expert in psychology, and who was, I believe, a professor, quite a famous professor at Rhodes University. But anyway, um, and he got me in touch also with his colleagues when I was probably about 8 years old or so, and then I better yet understood how to formulate my project, which started at 10 years old. So I'd already worked out the conceptual outline when I was 7 years old as to how I was going to fulfill this project. But that information was very helpful, because I knew that essentially, uh, I mean, from their experience, uh, well, I mean, they confirmed, because also, I mean, I was a bit of a prophet, I guess, and I said things, and I was able to use their bank of clinical knowledge, as it were, to find the answers to certain questions, and to tentatively, you know, structure certain things, that there was enough synchronous alignment between what I was, let's say, already anticipating, and essentially they allowed their knowledge to be used by me, and I anticipated that this is exactly how it would go. Then is that I would spend essentially 20 years or so, or actually I'm completely so if I was 8 years old at the time, I would have spent about 14, 15 years gathering raw data within certain conceptual categories. And then I would have a major manic episode. And just like in Homeland, the series Homeland, in which the bipolar CIA agent has a major manic episode, and while she does so, she connects all the dots and she sees, oh, yes, this is how it works, this is how it works. And she's babbling and she's babbling and she doesn't make sense, but she's connecting the dots, and she cracks the case. She actually works out. She intimates what Zakawi's story was in the background. And that's what I was able to do. And if you look at, while I was reconstituting my mind, which took me 6 months, all I was doing was creating what look like mandalas, but they're not mandalas. They are very compacted inside. I mean, they are. Uh, uh, it's the emergence of metagram essentially, um, and there are some correspondences between that metagram modeling and metatype, but essentially that allowed me essentially to see the scope of all of the four fields, because I mean it just so happens that I was lucky enough that but you see, but there is a question mark here, because I can't claim to know everything, because there is a third of metagram which is which I permutated, which I jettisoned right away, because I just said, no, this is non sequitur. You cannot. This does not. If you had a false ego that operated this way, they could not. I actually believed that they wouldn't be able to breathe. They wouldn't be able to live. Like they wouldn't. It would be a miscarriage essentially. I didn't believe that it was possible that a mind could engage in that way, and have any kind of, anyway. But that is something to be reconstituted at some point. But I don't think I need to look under that stone, or in that closet at this point. Um, so yeah, I've got 48 metagram time, and this is perhaps why there are these asymmetries, because some metatypes have 5 metagrams, and some have 3, and some have 2. It's all a peculiar sort of array, and that is also because of the peculiar distribution of the final 5 between, the other 12 in the 17 model. The whole thing is peculiar, um, but also, and that also needs to be perhaps premised from the start, which is from the, need to find that 1960s book on grammar theory. I think, yeah, it was actually just called Grammar Theory was the name of the book, and I can't even remember the author. But anyway, um, because I adapted some very fine work that was done. I mean, as far as I can tell, all real scholarship, somewhat terminated after the 60s. There's been nothing but trash ever since. I haven't seen any. I mean, obviously, there's probably some corridors of some scientists, but I mean, after that, I think it's just Einstein. I think really screwed things up with general relativity. But anyway, that's my personal view. Uh, he's just the kind of the latest Newton, essentially. But I mean, in some sense, it makes sense that perhaps that was a conspiracy and it was necessary, because now we're in an age where if anyone can actually think a bit too hard about these things, they can perhaps blow up the planet with a laser beam that creates an uncontrollable fusion chain reaction, um, which is a real thing that you can make, which perhaps should not be mentioned in a recording, but that is wholly possible to do. I mean, that's not even science fiction. I mean, people know that you can draw that up, and it's not that hard to do, because all you need to do is create essentially enough fusions to start the chain of reaction in normal matter, and which is probably not that much. Anyway, very stupid tangent. Or perhaps not so. I mean, this is perhaps why these things are gated. Um, because, with just knowledge freely available, you're capable of standing on the shoulders of people that you did not have to develop in the same way that they had to develop in order to gain access to the fruits of uh, their genius, as it were. Anyway, is this a form of and in some sense, I think that might be the root of hubris, in some sense, which is again uh, to my point that sin is not just a personal thing; it's an emergent phenomena. Um, what did they say? The sins of the father are visited onto the son, and that is true in the sense that we have a tacit. Um, we are tacitly bound by secrets and contexts and secret contexts, as it were. Um, and what did Jesus say? Forgive them, for they know not what they do. And that I think is oh anyway, that's the spiritual resolution to the problem. But we need some hard structural reforms in my estimation, as an individual, as a discerning individual. And I just say two things: is I just want expertise, legally recognized expertise, to have the proper uncarefulness guarded against, and unseriousness and dishonesty, because there are lots of derivative pseudo intellectuals who will use big words and fancy terms, and especially, I will just say, the sanctity. When the sanctity of certain values uh, leads to a certain fundamental debasement, which is why, I mean, I have all these strange opinions. I have the opinion that vegetarianism is actually not good for society, because it teaches people that animals are somehow morally equivalent to human beings that have human understanding. Uh, as an individual choice, that's fine, or as a dietary choice, that's fine. But the morality of of this tacit confusion that essentially the spirit in an animal that does not have a spiritual discerning and an understanding, that does not have conceptual thinking in its mind, if it doesn't have conceptual component thinking, it's not about language, it's about concepts. It's about self-determinism and free will. It's about choice. Um, it's about being deliberate. If you cannot be deliberate about things, uh, and you can only be deliberate with conceptual thinking. I've got a recording here, so I don't just have this in my back pocket to pull out. But and when you equate living flesh with just the same thing as something that has an understanding, you demean Christ consciousness, or at least the thinking in the mind, because there is communication without the spoken word. There is still the word without the spoken word. And maybe people also are in certain states of suspension where they are remote from communication mind to mind. Understanding to understanding. And sadly, that's actually the state of most of people anyway. Um, they are sentient, but because they have the capacity to understand and exercise free will and self-determinism and be deliberate and have conceptual thinking. So they have the capacity, they're sentient, but they do not have an understanding yet. And this is not a permanent defect, uh, because the spirit is not the same thing as the soul, but also the soul itself uh, is not lost. The book, as it were, of the soul is only read by the Father, which is the same animating force that sustains and maintains all of us, And so, for people that can't understand, it's not for us uh, to supplement uh, let's say, the emergent purpose. And in some sense, sentience is the proof, essentially, that there is a deliberate choice to be made, and there are two things that need to be integrated, as it were, that the spirit of man and the spirit of God are at some point two sides of the same coin. And this, I think, is the meaning of comforter. I guess we just have to make sure that our comfort is uh, comes from our understanding. It is justified. It's not just uh, sourced from, let's say, a vague or nebulous abyss that is loosed on, unleashed upon a whole set of issues and concerns, which then essentially sit under the sea of some uh, because the sea almost looks alive itself. It's always moving. It's got troughs and waves, or sometimes it can be, the surface can be calm, and sometimes um, and essentially it's got so much motion in it, but it's just taking the shape of its container, and and all of its forces are donated to it by its external uh, by external factors, by the wind against it, by the moon pulling at it, um, perhaps the spins of certain things. I don't even know all the different external forces, but it's life that's doing that. But real life that lives within the sea, the actual living creatures there. Um, well, just trying to make a distinction between the living and the dead. Um, and so, sentience is what gives something a moral standing. Sentience is what gives something the status of a living soul. Um, and if something is sentient, if a person is sentient, well, I mean, when I say something, because it's like, I think that there can be other things that are also very close to sentience. I mean, I don't know about whales. I don't know about also artificial intelligence, if that may come. We must be very careful, uh, or and perhaps also alien species and things like that. That what we value and respect as sentience, uh, not overt, deliberate understanding and free will. That if we don't respect sentience, uh, because we can also lose our own self determinism in a bind, in a if you don't have if you don't have a footing, you know, if you don't have any footing on a subject, you don't have an understanding of it, and so your actions relative to that subject uh, cannot be called anything other than essentially mistaken or mistake prone. But I mean, in some sense, I guess I do think that these are distinctions upon distinctions, but essentially, I would just say that if you have the hope, the sufficient hope of an understanding, of an integrated understanding towards final reconciliation, then you have a good enough hope that your sentience is qualified. Um, Although you can have that as an individual, you don't have necessarily good faith unless you share that good hope with somebody else. Without shared hope, there is no faith, because faith cannot exist uh, in isolation. Uh, it can in a hypothetical sense, but essentially that is the class of faith without works. Faith without works is dead. So you could call it a dormant faith or something like that, or I don't, I mean, you could call it a potential faith that you have. So, whatever. But essentially, this is the need for a spiritual brethren, for the culture, as it were. And the brethren of the spirit is not that's just a, let's say, a symbolic archetypal thing, that essentially the spark in our mind is essentially in the hermetic alchemical metaphor. It is masculine as the soul is feminine. Um, the vessel of water, as it were, that holds the memory, in the soul. So the pages of the book. So the pages of the book that is judged by the Father is the soul, but the pen that wrote in the book, that wrote the story of the book, that is the masculine. And then the reader is the Father, and the reader has a full library, essentially. But anyway, there were some more important distinctions I wanted to make about sentience and understanding, but so, we were talking about, hmm, yeah, it's interesting that essentially in secular society now, faith has been completely displaced by what I would call the expertise of psychology and psychiatry, which is why I also anticipated this problem and wanted essentially to create an alternative psychology, because psychology is in some sense the most languishing, incomplete, or let's say pathetic field in the academy, and it should be the queen of the sciences. Psychology is required to be the queen of the sciences. It needs to actually, everything needs to be rooted into psychology. It needs to be the cornerstone. But instead, you see these psychologists trying to lick the boots of the neuroscientists, who are trying to lick the boots of, what are they called? I don't know, some kind of biochemical thing. I mean, it's we've had the full biochemistry of human physiology for a while now, actually, and it's meaningless and devoid of use. Well, not all use, but essentially, it's it's worthless, because unless you know the themes, unless you know how it functions in layers of aggregation and layers of synergy and uh, um, you know it doesn't mean a thing. It really doesn't. And all these things are actually much more controlled in the blood, which is essentially, if you feel your own blood and you respond to it, and your brain is conscious of monitoring it, um, and this is why I believe some people are capable. I mean, how do you think evolution ever actually happens? This idea of random mutation. I mean, it's utterly stupefying. You know, sit in the sun, you'll get more. You'll mutate more with more ultraviolet. I mean, it's uh, I mean, all of these theories are approximate circus tents that encapsulate the truth, but have no hope of explaining or discerning between the actual mechanism that causes the function to occur. And even with, if you accept evolution, you have to say that it no longer applies to us, because we no longer live inside a selective pressure environment which uh, lives inside of the culture, which lives inside, in some cultures, of the individual. And so when you actually go up and up and up, where's everything premised? What's at the top of the hierarchy in the material sense? It's in the individual mind. If it doesn't work there, where is it going to work ever? If there's no understanding, at least in some person's mind, then and this is why it was even known a long time ago, by some of the judges, even in the secret covenant, that the Son of Man is Adam is not the forefather as much as the Son of Man uh, is the ancestor of Adam. That your ontological ancestors are your spiritual descendants. And this is how you recover uh, your spiritual lineage, as it were. This is how the practices, of, the Hindus say from the Gita in the start, and this is not what is said by Krishna, but this is what is said by Arjuna. He says the those in the line of disciplic succession say that when the practices, I'm paraphrasing, I can't get that those whose practices are dishonored or disowned or are put or are no longer performed, when the practices of one's ancestors are disowned or whatever, or discontinued, that then those practitioners reside always in hell. And the Son of Man is the solution to that conundrum. Is that how can we be different and to our ancestors, but not relinquish them into some abyss, some void, some shadowy place that now. But also, I mean, this also has a very strange idea that death is something that cannot be conquered. And in some sense, I believe that what is happening in some of these types that go off the four corners of the earth, that what they are in fact projecting is the memory of the dead that is contained, in some sense they're being haunted, I think, perhaps, um, by the remembrances of and I think they might not even know that they're doing this. It might just be a kind of it's perhaps what that bloodline is doing. It's just perhaps, that in somewhere within a certain family tree, what grows up is in the next generation then interacts. I mean, there's action at a distance here as well. So it's not necessarily immediate interaction, but essentially you are being passed on the mantle of the spiritual mantle of the memory of the line of the dead, as it were, and they are perhaps places where they find homes in the living, because there are people perhaps that are the other half of this puzzle, as it were, that they're. And I don't want to talk about, because this sounds very strange, like necromagic or whatever, or something like that. But they, I think, I mean, I would have to look at again. There are three. There's a third of Metagram that I didn't even plot, so there could be something in there, or there could be with the other ones. But there are certain types of false ego complex which are single circuits, and these single circuits, in some sense, I think, I don't know if it's possible. These single circuits, I don't think it's possible to have an understanding if you're a single circuit. I don't know. I have to think about this more. But in some sense, I think that there is a fundamental problem if you just have a single circuit. Because I don't think that you're capable of actually. Because I think you need at least 2 points to form an understanding. And this is a large portion of the population. I mean, I've heard. Oh, I've only had one discussion with another person about it recently, but I've heard that maybe 30% of the population are one of these single circuits. But I also it might also be possible that certain metagrams can be combined with other metagrams to give them a double circuit. That also might be possible, but essentially that combination might come from one of these projectors as well. this is very theoretical. I should not even be talking about this because, or I have to, sadly, to find out more. I have to kind of voice what my current tentative thinking is. But I am influenced by the things that I read in Revelations, where it talks about the key to death and Hades and such, and but I don't necessarily think that people have to be projecting these things into the world. I think that it's amazing how water holds memory, and the salt water of the sea. I mean, salt has always been the residue of life. You burn living matter enough, you get down to salt. But anyway, um, what's to say? The other thing I was looking at, the other possibility that I was looking at here is these single circuits. I might be wrong about that as well. I'm just, you see, it's so much clerical work that is needed, but to me, it's, there might be some that are single circuits, but in some sense, I think it might not be possible. Because you need at least three distinct emotional turns, and that means that it would at least be in two different field circuits. So there would at least be two different field circuits. But you see, that's the problem, is that, like, for example, Tamas, because of the internal circuitry of Metagram, because of the actual sequence of Tamas, that second field becomes an internal, it's not open to that field. It's internally propositioned. So it becomes like a private seclusion. And so you would need, I mean, this is why I think auditing is necessary, inverted commas, in the Scientology sense, that you need somebody else to work through with it. You need actually somebody else to help you, to be the soundboard, as it were, and to help inquire into the matter. But also why, yeah, so that's, uh, well, which in some sense I think is generally what is being described also in Ephesians chapter 4, when it talks about the constitution and composition and the function of the body of Christ, the members in particular, in terms of the offices and the edification, unto the full stature of the fullness of the Christ, which is the function of the church, is to bring people into the fullness and the full stature of the Christ. Not blown about by the winds of doctrine. That's literally what it says in Ephesians chapter 4. What else? I'll just say this now, but if you're going to read scriptures that I point out, then I'll just say to also have a look at 1 John chapter 4 and 1 John chapter 5, and all the scripture that I like to point out. I just say, please read it in the King James Version. I don't endorse any other translation. I think the John Dewey Bible is not so bad, but I prefer the King James because I think that the tense of it is precise, because the Greek, the the reason why Greek is so brilliant is because it's very true to how time actually functions on a spiritual level. It's got, um, which is why there's so many F's in the King James, and because you don't know what tense it's happening, because you're not supposed to know what tense it's happening, because it's become an infinitive. They're using it in the sense of the infinitive. It's not that, oh, it did happen. So this is exactly why people start misunderstanding the scripture so harshly. But I mean, the scriptures are not good for everyone to listen to, or to read, because they'll just mislead themselves, essentially, sadly. The scriptures are not open to everyone. That's just blanketly a fact. Um, there is no immediate authority in the wordings of the script. It's only the understanding of it has any authority. Only, it's not a spell book. You don't just say the words and then magic happens. You have to understand the words, and then spirituality is happening. You know, um, anyway, I think I've exhausted my topics. And it doesn't help that I'm speculating all these horrible things that might frighten people. At least if they don't just think I'm a crackpot. Um, so what else? The projectors. Should I say anything more? I was talking about tamas. Yeah, so tamas essentially become a pseudo single field. And that's problematic, because that's a kind of stagnation that I don't think you can actually. Sadly, you actually need authority. You just need, like, you need to have a fancy title for them. For that sort, you need to have like a kind of, oh, look at all the badges on my vest. Look at all the certificates that I have on my wall. Or perhaps some kind of more personable interaction. But I guess when the only interaction is supposedly substantive. Hmm. I was going to say about the emo thing is that I think the function of emo is to see things far away, is to quest for something, is to be on the lookout for something. That if you are emo with an openness of vigilance, I think that there's nothing wrong with that. But essentially, to imbibe one's own emotions, to be drunken on them, I mean, that's literally the description of the Whore of Babylon, quite frankly. I mean, or no, sorry, it's actually the description of the vanity which is represented by the kings and the rich merchants of Babylon the Great, who are wroth on the fornication with the whore. They actually are inebriated, not by the sex, not by the fornication with the whore, but on the anger that they receive from fornicating with the whore. That the fornication with the whore of Babylon makes them angry, makes them wroth, and then the wrath is what makes them inebriated, is what makes them drunk. That they are drunk on the wrath from the fornication with the whore. That is a toxic kind of emo, which you cannot. I mean, that's a vanity that is not seeking to perfect itself. That's a vanity that's seeking to continue to delude itself and cloud itself. Um, anyway, I mean, there's still lots of things that I need to. I haven't reread certain things. At some point, I need to reread certain things, and I need to get my writing of this book in order. I thought of a whole beautiful introduction, which I've probably forgotten about now. Um, Talking about how much of a glad fly I have been in many different sects and many different schools of thinking. Um, and how lonely I am, I guess, as well. Uh, Being as I'm not able to be received by any of those who or at least not publicly. So having no reputation, having no, for all, well, perhaps I'm just crazy, all the great things that I have done, all the great collaborations that I have made that have gone, but fame would certainly be worse. But I do lack power because I would like more power to. There are dangerous things that are happening that I can do nothing against, as even some people that I know I see exacerbate the problem because of their. Well, I can't directly communicate with anyone uh, that I supposedly know in perhaps my own crack pottery, my strange, mysterious past even to myself. But it's weird having this idea that I have sheep in many folds, but perhaps it's just because I have a messiah complex. Isn't that what they call it? Which makes me again then quite vulnerable to the ravages of psychiatry that have not gone. Yeah, I must say that is quite the anathema of my current standing is that if I misstep, then I am perhaps subject and prone to the ravages of a brave new world, perhaps, which is in the process of being dawned, and all these people, they can just confect whatever narrative they so wish to align themselves with. They can see the silver lining on the cloud, and then they orientate themselves towards that. Uh, Having left the fray, but I guess that's the curse of. It's weird. It's like the inverse of what I have. I believe I have the doctrine, but I don't have the power. And other people, I would say, relinquish their own power because of want of a doctrine. But anyway, that's not the polarity on which that I try to disseminate my messages. But it is certainly something that plagues me in my weaker moments. Uh, but that's just somewhat the curse of the Metatype 13, always feeling sorry for yourself in some metaphysical sense. But I'd like to think that I've perfected that vanity by now. That it is worked out in my crucifixion. But anyway, that's at least to show some of the my personal workings of my own technology uh, upon myself. But perhaps I should update a model of the crucifixion because I'm not sure that was in those 4 hours, which I don't. So perhaps I should try to talk about that in terms of the technology of the metatype in some sense, because in some sense this also keys you out of the field circuits entirely as well. So in some sense, I mean that's what would be otherwise called, let's say, transcendental enlightenment, which is I would say distinct from other forms of enlightenment, because there are two, in my understanding, there are two forms of enlightenment, and one of them is one with understanding and one without understanding. And if you have enlightenment without understanding, uh, you're basically a free radical, which is in some sense what I am to some degree as well. I'm also a free radical, but in some sense I think um, that's not for want of capacity. I think I do have an understanding, but anyway, perhaps I should try and recover my John the Baptist somewhere.